Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how to heal through trauma transmutation. So since today's video is all about trauma transmutation, let's talk a little bit about trauma first. So trauma is basically what happens whenever we experience an emotion that's too intense for us to process at a given time. This usually particularly happens in emotionally trying situations, like a survival kind of situation. So for example, let's say that we are in the middle of a war zone and we're experiencing all these terrible things going on around us. We're not going to be able to deal with the intensity of emotion that brings up at that given time. And so the trauma response comes in and makes all of that unconscious to us so we can focus on coping and surviving through that situation temporarily. And then what can happen is we can go back later on and process through those emotions that come up later. So when I think about what happens in the mind-body complex when we experience trauma, I think about it a lot like what happens when a light bulb processes electricity. So a light bulb has a certain degree of processing power relative to electricity. So if you have a 100-watt light bulb, it can only process 100 watts of electricity. And if you pump 200 watts of electricity into the light bulb will blow out. Now, with human beings, we have our central nervous system where we process our emotions. And our central nervous system, like the light bulb, has a limited amount of emotional processing power. So we have a certain degree of emotional wattage. So let's say that we have 100 watts of emotional wattage, but we experience some kind of traumatic situation that brings up really intense emotions, 200 watts, 300 watts, 400 watts. What happens then is, we're not like the light bulb, we don't blow out, we're a much more sophisticated mechanism than that. But what happens is our trauma response comes in, and our mind and our body find ways to keep those emotions down in the unconscious so that we don't have to deal with the overwhelm that comes from them. And then we can later go in and process through those traumas and those emotions later. So what happens when this trauma response pushes everything into the shadow, it doesn't really go away. It helps us cope through the situation and get by, but at the same time, it can create some pretty gnarly neuroses and patterns, so it can keep us in, toxic relationship cycles. It can make us anxious and depressed. It can create all kinds of different issues in our lives. And so when it comes to processing trauma, it's really important for us to be able to go in and do that. And that's specifically why I'm talking about trauma transmutation today, is that I find that this is a very effective way to process through trauma and to really be able to make what's become unconscious conscious again so that we can process through things. So what is transmutation, you might ask? Well, transmutation in simplest terms is to change something into something else. So you are converting something from one form into another form. Now, in the field of science, what this refers to is where you change an atom into another type of atom through changing the protons and neutrons that exist within those atoms. So if you change those things around, it becomes a different type of element. But this term transmutation actually predates modern science to the precursor to science, which is alchemy. And in alchemy, it was thought that you could turn base metal into gold through putting it through certain processes. And that process of changing base metal into gold is transmutation. And this was very rich with symbolism because it meant so much in relation to our growth and our individuation as people, because we could take our negative situations and turn them into something positive. Or we can take, the perceived base metal of the personality and exalt it up into this higher, more divine form. So when it comes to the transmutation of trauma, what it means is we are taking the base metal of trauma and we are going to exalt that and bring that up into this higher state of being the gold of the personality. So it's a little bit like that phrase, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So basically, if you find a way to work through the hardships and adversity and trauma you've experienced in life, you can actually mine that for untapped potentials that wouldn't have otherwise come up. So when we transmute our trauma, what we're doing is we're taking something that is impacting us detrimentally, and we're going to turn it into something that is going to be beneficial to us, something that will enable us to bring more of our untapped potential up to the surface of consciousness. So to do this, there are two main things that we really have to hammer down in this video. So the first thing is we have to get the mindset right around trauma. There are a lot of different ideas around trauma that are very antithetical to the process of transmutation. So basically there's a lot of things that make us just feel like, oh, if we've experienced trauma, then that means that we're broken or that there's something wrong. And with this mindset, it makes it very, very difficult, if not impossible, to really grow through that trauma. So the first thing is really changing the mindsets around trauma and thinking about trauma in a more productive kind of way. The second thing is basically being able to sit with those emotions that are so uncomfortable that the trauma response pushed away. And so what I'll do is I'll first talk a little bit about the mindset, and then at the end I'll tell you all about how to sit with those emotions and how to process through them. So as the first matter of business, when it comes to that mindset shift around trauma, it's really about trying to drop resistance to the trauma and come to an acceptance and even approval of all of the things that have happened in our life. Now, when I say finding approval and acceptance for this thing, that doesn't mean that you have to think that it was a good thing or that you have to think in a positive way about the event that happened. You know, you can still retain those kind of emotions around what happened. You know, you can still acknowledge that what happened was detrimental and painful, and in general would be something that you would want to avoid in the future. You know, and I definitely don't recommend going looking for trauma for the sake of trauma transmutation. But what I mean is finding approval for how things have gone in your life, accepting every experience that you've been through as a vital experience for shaping who you are, whether those experiences were positive or very negative. Now, it can be quite difficult to come to a state of acceptance of the situations that have happened in our life that have been traumatic because of cultural attitudes around what trauma means. A lot of times people look at trauma and they think, oh, well, trauma means that a person is damaged, or trauma means that you're forever going to be in this negative, painful state. And that's simply not true. But I think that this is very reflective of our culture that's very based around, you know, commodification and consumerism, to the point of, like, if we have an object, let's say, and the object breaks, oftentimes we just throw the object out. So it becomes like, oh, as soon as there's a flaw in something, then it's no longer worth our consideration. You know, it hasn't always been the case that that's been the way we've oriented to objects, but I think that we in many ways internalize that toward ourselves. That if we're so quick to let go of objects, we ourselves will devalue ourselves if we sense that, oh, there's something that's not okay here, or there's something that's not right. And so being able to look at these kind of ingrained attitudes around like brokenness and disposability and things like that, I think is very relevant when it comes to thinking about the traumas that we've experienced in life. Now, as a contrast to this cultural tendency, we can look at the centuries-old Japanese practice called Kinsugi. So Kinsugi would be where, let's say you had a tea bowl, and that tea bowl shattered on the ground into several pieces. What would then happen is that the person who owned the bowl would take the bowl and stick it back together using gold. And so it would come back to about its usual shape, only would have these little gold cracks. And it was thought that, you know, these experiences of like the bowl shattering or the wear and tear on the bowl were actually just important parts in the life of this object. And so in this way, we can look at ourselves in the same light. So that it's the times that we have broken apart completely, and then we've had to bring ourselves back together, that creates those little gold cracks in our personality. Whenever we've had to come through a really trying situation, and whenever we've come through from one side to the other, that's when we really transmute ourselves from the broken tea bowl on the ground to the mended tea bowl that has all of the golden cracks in it that show our wisdom and our experience. Also, interestingly enough, we have gold being a symbol of transmutation, just in the same way that gold was a symbol of transmutation in the practice of alchemy. Another example of this would be the process of scarification. So scarification in many cultures has been used as a symbol of a rite of passage into adulthood, showing a certain type of wisdom or a certain type of achievement. And it's the idea that if there are wounds there that become scars, it's through that process of healing them into scars that we acquire a certain type of wisdom, much like the tea bowl acquires a certain type of beauty through going through that process of falling apart and then mending. So an important mindset shift here is that scars equal wisdom. Now, when it comes to scars, I think it's important to differentiate between scars and wounds. So wounds are something that have an emotional charge. They are painful. When we experience them, we get these really intense emotions coming up to the surface that are very difficult for us to deal with. And it's the wounds that really create a lot of issue for us. And so it's these unhealed wounds that exist in the unconscious that we want to bring up to the surface and to have this transmutation process to take the emotional sting out of it. But when it comes to scars, scars are the end result of that mending process. Scars are what happen when we come from one end of our trauma, we move through it and we come to the other end. So it's not as though we go back to the way that things were before the trauma. The trauma will have always shaped us. And that's something we also have to come to grips with, that we're not going to get back to where we were beforehand. But if we move through the trauma, what happens is that wound, it heals and it loses its emotional sting. And then we come into this space of greater experience and wisdom that we can then use to help other people and to help us navigate forward in life in the future without all of the pain and the trauma and the neuroses that come from the open wounds that are as a result of unresolved trauma. So when it comes to the phrase, that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger, it's true only if you can bring your wounds into the state of being a scar instead. So if your wounds remain as wounds and continue to fester in the unconscious, that doesn't confer wisdom because you're so busy dealing with the trauma cycles that are happening there. And so it's really, really important to be able to sit with those and accept those emotions and process through them. So in a nutshell, you're trying to come to a state of acceptance and approval for all things that have happened in your life, both positive and negative. And the way to do that is to recognize that there's a certain strength of character that develops and can only develop through really working through the pains and the hardships and the traumas that we've experienced. So understanding that having experienced trauma doesn't mean that you're going to be this broken tea bowl that just gets dumped in the trash. What you're going to be is you're going to be the tea bowl that you mend back together with gold. And it's that gold that gives you that wisdom, that gives you that experience and that ability to help other people. And on top of that, also realizing that we're not always going to have to deal with the pain of the trauma, even as we've been shaped by it. So the main thing that's negative about the trauma is when we have these wounds that are constantly causing us grief, that are constantly bringing up all these painful emotions, that are keeping us in patterns and cycles that we want to break out of. That is something that we can actually process through and remove the emotional sting. We can neutralize our trauma. And when we do that, when we change something that was once a wound into a scar, we can then orient to that in such a way that it isn't this incredibly painful experience, but something that we're able to get an objective perspective on. And so what the next part of this video is about, it's about really sitting with the emotions unconditionally, because that's the thing that helps us to process through the trauma. So because the trauma comes up on the level of the body, what we have to do is we have to fix our awareness instead of up here in the mind on those sensations that occur in the body. And with our unconditional presence and with our awareness fixing upon those emotions, that's the thing that actually helps those emotions process through. So remembering back to the first part of the video when I was talking about the trauma response and how the mind and body work together to keep us from processing those emotions, what happens is those emotions get pushed into the unconscious. And so this process is all about making those unconscious emotions conscious again. So the idea here is that we want to fix our awareness on those emotions unconditionally, no matter what they are, and to be able to expand our capacity to feel our emotions without becoming overwhelmed. And then also being able to sit with the emotions, like let's say during a body scan meditation or just in meditation in general, allowing our emotions to come up. This enables us to get the message that our body is trying to send to us. So the emotions come up as a result of the body trying to communicate something to us. And so when we hold space for that, and it allows the body to feel like, oh, we got the message, we are able to let things go much more easily. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to cultivate more capacity to hold space for the emotions and to actually hold space for those past emotions that got pushed away due to the trauma response. Now, a bit of a caveat that I would offer with regard to this is that you want to make sure that you're taking this very gradually. So if you have 100 watts of emotional processing power, you want to go 100 watts at a time. So when you go to sit down for your body scan meditation or, focus somewhere on the body, so that you can process through these emotions, you don't want it to come at you like a tidal wave where it's too much happening at once. What you want to do is you want to kind of step your toes into the water just gradually at first. You want to make sure that you're not being overwhelmed, because what will happen is just the trauma response will happen again, and it'll push all of those things outside of your awareness and fortify maybe even those barriers so that they're harder to access in the future. So you want to be taking on your awareness of these emotions quite gradually, and also stretching your capacity to be able to experience your emotions in general. Anyway, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Also, I'm currently having a Halloween special, so for today and today only, today the day that it's released, October 31st, up through midnight, I have 10% off of everything in my store. All you have to do is enter the code 10% at checkout to get the discount. So that's my coaching, my dream work coaching, and also my tarot readings. And then I also have 20% off of my 6-week shadow integration crash course, which is also a one-on-one program where it's focused towards shadow integration and consciousness work facilitation. And there's homework every week with videos and things like that. So if that's something that you think you'd be interested in, I'll leave the link below in the description box and also in the comments section. Anyway, that's all I have for you for now, and until next time, keep becoming more you.